Well, good morning.
Good morning.
Yeah, I'm glad to be back up here. I just love coming up here. And my wife, Reverend Margie Brock, says her hi and hello. I think she spoke here a couple weeks ago about Myrtle Fillmore, the torchbearer of the light. And Margie's down at the Spiritual Life Center this morning leading the meditation at James Trapp's church. So the Brocks have got Sacramento and Auburn covered.
Thank you.
So, I never cease to amaze at how Spirit works through these services. This morning I was sitting reading my daily word at breakfast, and I noticed the line about, I am faith in action. I am faith in action. Right in our daily word. Now, I didn't look ahead on that, and I put this talk together some time ago, and your songs, how they weave together, we don't talk about what songs to sing. It just amazes me how Spirit works these services together. But this morning I want to talk about this gift of faith, this mental faculty of faith that we have. Now, in the Unity 12 Powers concept, our co-founder, Charles Fillmore, identified 12 spiritual faculties within our bodies that represent the Christ of our being. In 1929, he wrote a series of articles starting in January up through December on these 12 powers. And later in 1930, they were put together in a book called The 12 Powers of Man. And the very first power that he talked about was this power of faith. Now, Mr. Fillmore has an interesting definition of faith. There's a good ministerial student some years ago I latched right onto because it really speaks to my heart, and it speaks about our unity theology. Faith is the perceiving power of mind linked with the power to shape substance. The perceiving power of mind linked with the power to shape substance. Now, Fillmore, like some of the early New Thought writers, identified these powers or mental faculties in a specific place in our body. And interestingly, in the 1920s, Charles thought that the pineal gland, right in the very top of our head, the very center of our head, was identified with the power of faith. And the pineal gland is a little pine cone-shaped gland. Living up here in the foothills, we know about pine cones. And it's right in the very center of the hemispheres. Now, back in the 20s, they knew it was there, but they weren't really sure what it did. And interestingly, the pineal gland has to do with our level of awakeness. It secretes this hormone called melatonin, and it has to do with our sleep cycles and how awake we are. And if you remember the story of Siddhartha Gautama, also known as the Buddha, after sitting under the Bodhi tree for 49 days, has this enlightenment. He walks into a village and a man says, "Are you a god?" And Siddhartha says, "No." He says, "Are you a man?" He says, "No." He says, "What are you?" He says, "I am awake." So when we tune into our period of enlightenment, we become awake. We're activating this power of faith in our life. Charles also identifies it with an apostle. That's one of Charles Fillmore's unique things with these different mental faculties. He chose to identify him with one of the disciples that were with Jesus of Nazareth. And for faith, he chose Peter. And interestingly, Peter's kind of the one that showed a little lack of faith. He denied him 3 times. He questions his mission. But later on in life, Peter becomes one of the strongest supporters of the early movement in Jerusalem and gets the movement moving. This definition of faith that Charles uses, the perceiving power of the mind linked with the power to shape substance. Power to shape substance. That's our power of imagination. Our power of imagination. One of the examples that I've come across as identifying this concept of faith is the little batteries that are in our clickers that open up our cars. They're about the size of a nickel or a dime if you ever had to replace one. And on one side it's got a big plus, and on the other side it's nothing or negative. Because I've heard it said, we have all the faith that we need. It's just Depends where we're applying it. Now this morning when I sat down in that chair, I had faith that it was going to hold me up. Now I had faith when I stepped on the brake pedal that my little Geo Metro was going to slow down. So it depends upon where we apply our faith. Are we using it positively or are we using it negatively? And that little band around the edge of the thing, I think that's our power of imagination. Because in Unity, our third principle is we shape our experiences by the power of our imagination, by the power of our thoughts. Everything in this room started with a thought in the mind of an inventor. There was a mind, there was an idea, and then there was manifestation. And in our vision statement, we said we're co-creators of our world. And how do we co-create that? Through the power of our mind. And in Unity, the thing is, if we don't like where we're at, think about our thinking. Sometimes Margie will question me. I'll be kidding around saying something, and she'll say, honey, do you really want that to happen in your life? No. But if I'm adding energy and emotion to these thoughts, there's a good probability that that's going to become manifested. One of the highlights that I get to do each week is I do a radio show on Unity Online Radio called the Unity Classic Radio, Words from Our Past. And I get to read the unpublished material from our co-founder, Charles Fillmore, that are in the Unity Library and Archives. And in this August, it'll be 5 years that I've been doing this. Some time ago, Charles Fillmore had a talk on courage and fear from back in 1924. And he said this, the imagination is a very wonderful thing, but you have to watch your imagination because it works in what might be termed a spiritual plane. It works in the ideal, and the ideal is always larger than the realization. Now, Charles is using some Unity speak there. He's talking about the term ideal and realization. An ideal is that mental pattern of perfection. Mental pattern of perfection. And our realization is the dawning of truth in the consciousness. The dawning of truth in the consciousness. That's that feeling we get when we know that we know, even though it may not have shown up in our life. We can have that inner knowing. My little Geo Metro provides ample opportunities for me to learn Unity principles. I grew up on the west side of Chicago. And back then, the media was full of stories of people who got off the expressway at the wrong stop or broke down in the wrong neighborhood, and they were seriously hurt or possibly even killed. So to me, when a vehicle broke down, I was panicked. I remember being 8 years of age with my sister who was 5, these 3 years. We're driving along in our old 1949 DeSoto that my dad was driving. He used to pick these clunkers. Died. And my sister and I in the back seat are going, oh, we're going to die. And my parents said, what are you doing? I remember talking with a counselor buddy of mine. He says, Bob, you might want to look at that a little closer. You're with your family, your protectors, and you think you're going to die? Come on. But there's this link of vehicle breakdowns and hazard to my health. Well, this has continued on throughout the years, but I've worked with it. And when I was at Unity Village, going through ministerial school, I was also working at Silent Unity. And I drove into the parking lot in Silent Unity for my work shift. And as I parked the car, I noticed a little whiff of something coming from the hood, either steam or smoke. And when I opened the hood, I seen antifreeze from the radiator. I went, oh my God. For a moment, panic set in. What am I going to do? And I thought, wait a minute, I'm in the most prayed up area of the country. I'm in front of Silent Unity. And I had the vehicle inspected by this mechanic for the Missouri safety check, and I had his card in my wallet. Cell phone, call him. And he says, Bob, I'm just down the road in Raytown. It's like 5 miles down the road. He says, and I have my truck with my auto trailer behind us. I can pick your car up and have it fixed. So he drives in, we load the Geo up, off he goes. And I went, yay, Spirit. Then my thinking sets in. I don't know who this mechanic is. He's never done work on my car in my life. Did I just give him my Visa card and say, cut here? So I got on the internet, checked out radiators. Oh my God, I know he's going to soak me with this. And when he called the next day, he said, Bob, your vehicle's ready to pick up, and the cost is, it was less than what I could have bought the radiator online, on the internet, not installed. So imagine that. That's kind of an example of what my ministerial student teacher, Reverend Dr. Tom Shepard, talks about embedded theology. Those are those beliefs that whoever got a hold of us first imprinted about how the world is like. And they're there. And they can rise up at the least inopportune time. And then as we get older, usually in our 30s, we come to this, what we call deliberative theology. We start to look at, what do I really believe about God and the world and how the world works? I remember being in my 30s, and I was on active duty with the Coast Guard. And each year we had to fill out the record of emergency data. And they had a block on religion. Well, I couldn't check Catholic. I hadn't started off in a Catholic faith as a little boy and up through high school. But I hadn't been in a Catholic church in years. So what could I put? I wasn't in Unity then. Could I put Christian? Oh, I could do that. Well, what does Christian mean? I had to go through this re-examining of what do I really believe about God, Spirit, and why we're here in the world, and whatever. Myrtle Fillmore, our other co-founder, talked about some interesting things. Students used to write into her asking her questions about what's happening in the world. And Myrtle responded to one of her inquiries saying, so long as we remember experiences they were unhappy as we saw them once, and still see them and speak of them, we will be unable to demonstrate joy and prosperity and health in our lives. So if I keep thinking in my old thoughts, I am not going to grow. And to another seeker she had written, to know how to hear with the mind, and to discern and discriminate between the true and the real and the worthwhile, and that which is mere foolishness and the clatter of elements not yet organized under law, is a real accomplishment. So as we go through this and understand how truth works in our life, that's a real accomplishment to do, and it takes work to do it. Using the example of Peter as the example of faith, one of the Bible stories that pops up in my mind is the story about Peter and Jesus walking on the water together. And the way the Bible story goes, it shows up in 3 of the different Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and John. Jesus was off preaching and teaching, and he sends the disciples on ahead in the boat. Now, this is not the one with the storm. But later on, he decides to walk out and meet them. And the disciples look from the boat and they see Jesus walking on the water. Now, at first they thought it was something weird, and they said, that's the Lord. They didn't recognize him. So Peter goes, it's Jesus, steps out of the boat, walks to him. Now, what was Peter's occupation? He was a fisherman. Fishermen fish from boats. So Peter, walking out, he's in his confidence and faith, gets in there, and all of a sudden he begins to realize where he is. His embedded theology rose right up to not support him in the water. And the story is Jesus grabbed him by the hand, kept him up, and then they get in the boat together. So Peter fell back into his embedded theology when he started to sink. And Jesus helped him back up and into the boat. So his deliberative theology, his belief in the power of his leader, helped him out. So if we look at that story metaphysically, like we can do in some of our Unity studies, looking into the consciousness of it, we can be traveling around in our spiritual boat. We can get out of that boat acting in faith, fully thinking we are knowing where we're going. But sometimes the reality of life hits us. Just reading in the newspapers this morning, some stuff. Do we really believe there is one presence, one power, God the good, active in the world and in the universe? Starting to sink. Wow. Is Christ present in each and every person? But if I reach within, grab that Christ presence, it can help pull me back up. Seeing beyond appearances. I'm a retired military officer, and stories about the military really catch my attention. And one of my favorite performers and comedians way back when on black and white TV was Jimmy Durante. Anybody remember Jimmy? This is Calabash. And well, Jimmy Durante had a warm spot in his heart for the military folks. And the director of one of the veterans facilities said, Mr. Durante, can you come and do a show for us? And Mr. Durante said, man, my schedule is booked. I really can't fit you in, but Jimmy had a warm spot for vets. So he said, I tell you what, I'll come up, I'll do maybe 10, 15-minute gig, and then I'm out of there, okay? Well, the director says, yes, he was just happy to have Mr. Durante there for anything. So Mr. Durante gets on stage. He starts doing his gig. 15 minutes comes by. A half an hour goes by. He's still up there. A whole full hour goes by. Jimmy Durante doesn't lose. Well, the director comes up and says, Mr. Durante, got me a little confused here. Says, you only said you had time for 15 minutes. What happened? So he calls him over to the side, and he look out from the curtain. He says, see in the front row there? And in the front row were two veterans. One had lost his left arm. The other had lost his right arm. They were sitting shoulder to shoulder, and they were clapping their hands together. So, when we get to look beyond appearances, we connect with one another and support one another, wonderful things can happen. Well, how do we do this? William James, the author of The Varieties of Religious Experience, a book about how people connect with spirit, had written this. William James suggested that the average religious believer had a religion made for him by others, communicated to him by tradition, determined by fixed forms, by imitation, and retained by habit. We're products of whoever got a hold of us first. But in unity, we have this power of choice. There was an old farmer, had his grandson visit him at his farm, and he says, I'm going to teach grandson some stuff about life. And he took him down to the sheep pen. He said, son, come here, I want to show you something. And he got on the other side of this little fence area, and he got this one ram to jump over the fence. He says, now watch. And he went up and he opened the gate wide. And then the rest of the sheep began to flow through this little area. And when it got to the area where the fence was, they began to jump over it. So he says, son, as you move through life, learn to make your own decisions. Don't follow along like a sheep. So as we bring this to a close, let's think about some of the unity principles that we have in our toolbox, in our spiritual toolbox. There is one presence, one power. We say it every Sunday. And that there is the Spirit of God, the Spirit of divinity within each and every one of us, regardless of appearances. Even that gentleman that almost smashed into my little Geo Metro in his big gray pickup truck. Christ was in there too. Christ was in me. And we can connect through prayer and meditation with this one presence, one power. And we can connect with each other in this one presence, one power through prayer and meditation as well. And sometimes we can regress to our childhood prayers. And here's a nice one we can work with. God is good, so am I. All is well. Thanks, goodbye. God is good, first principle. So am I, second principle. All is well, looking beyond appearances. Thanks, an attitude of gratitude. And goodbye. Release, let go, it is finished. Let's say that together. God is good. So am I. All is well.
All is well.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Namaste, dear ones.